Now let's focus on Greece. The country has unveiled new measures to meet the deficit targets set as the terms of the EU and IMF bailout deal. The government has pledged to reduce the deficit by 5.1 billion euros in 2011. The austerity measures should bring the deficit down to 7.4% of GDP. The cuts are larger than the over 2 billion euro cuts announced initially and may hinder recovery, which economists expecting a contraction of 3% next year. Let's discuss the topic with our guest now, John Sfakianakis, Chief Economist at Banque Saudi Fransi. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. Before we talk about the new austerity measures, don't you think that the number one priority for the Greek government should be the tax collection, which is, we all know that, a big issue?
Well, you're absolutely right. The collection is an issue, a major problem. They will continue to have this problem because, as you know, in Greece, it is probably the pastime of every Greek to evade taxes. The government will not be able to manage over the short term to correct this problem. And secondly, they have a massive contraction happening, which is creating a problem in terms of generating revenues from taxable companies.
VAT hike, freezing the level of pensions and so on, more austerity measures. Do you think it will be enough to reach the deficit targets?
Well, that could be the case. They could reach the deficit target. I'm not really concerned about that. I'm more concerned that they have rising unemployment, and unemployment this year could very well end up above 15%, closer to 18%. And if you include the part-timers, then you will have unemployment above 18% for this year, and again rising unemployment next year. The private sector is not growing, it's contracting. The competitiveness of the Greek economy, which is the major issue, is not yet being properly addressed.
So you're saying it's a kind of catch-22 situation. What would be the issue for you?
I think the biggest issue is competitiveness and a rising government debt. Government debt next year is most likely, and according to government figures, to reach 153% to GDP. So if you have that kind of a debt, and that is going to rise, recession in Greece will continue through 2012. Then you have a major problem. And the restructuring becomes an issue later on, not yet today.
And you see that as the inevitable outcome, that there will be, I think we all think there will be a restructuring of the Greek debt. Austerity with no growth is almost a pointless exercise. I think we all know that. So when you think 12 is the time frame in which this manifests itself?
Probably. I think right now they have enough money. They will continue. The third tranche will be allocated from the IMF and the ECB. Everybody is supportive. But the core issue is that they won't be able to generate the extra revenue they require, plus the competitiveness. And I always keep on saying to my friends in Greece that coffee prices in very popular areas of Athens have to decline to €1, and that's when you have the competitiveness coming back of Greece. Right now, coffee in Athens, in these areas, is going for €4. So you cannot have a competitive economy when you're charging everybody an arm and a leg.
So effectively you're inviting deflation because it has to be. It's just simply overinflated.
Absolutely. Deflationary economics have to set in order for Greece to become competitive.
Interesting email from Bob, who writes in and says, like thieves who come in the dead of night, here come the EU, the ECB and the IMF, all heading straight over to Ireland with one aim only, to tie the Irish government and its population even more tightly into the European federal state system. Best thing the Irish could do would be to turn round and say, we are not going to join, we are not going to stay members, we're going to default. That's a comment from Bob, who writes in from here in the UK. There does seem to be a very strong political angle on what is happening with Ireland here. And it's hard to get away from the fact that Greece would probably still do better, wouldn't it, if it wasn't in the Euro bloc at this point?
Yeah, I tend to believe that Greece is far better off being where it is, within the umbrella of the EU and the Eurozone rather than outside, simply because they would have had to devalue by 40 or 50%, and the debt they would have would have accumulated because of the devaluation. So they're better off being in the EU, otherwise nobody would have bailed them out. But definitely the crisis that we're seeing between the two, Ireland and the Greeks, is basically in Ireland a crisis of the banks and the private sector, over-leveraged, excessive. And in Greece it's the crisis of the state being overblown, inefficient, very ineffective and incapable of managing the problems that they have.
The way that this crisis is being managed, though, by Brussels and by the European Central Bank has defied logic at times. We have the largest economy in Europe, which has benefited from its relationship with its partners, setting the pace in this story by coming out and threatening the very people who would buy this debt from the ECB and from the governments. I just am struggling to understand why Angela Merkel has decided that the way forward is to force the pace, to accelerate the risks of sovereign default in Ireland, Greece, Portugal and Spain.
You're right. I think there is a need to be more measured, and I think at the core of this problem is that there is a crisis of leadership in the EU. The French are good, they're capable, but they're not the biggest. The Germans, they want to lead, but they're not willing to lead at the same time. And you have the peripheries. So there is a crisis of leadership in the European Union which is very, very serious. And the Germans have to learn that they have to adjust and they have to be very careful in what they utter and how they utter what they want to utter. So definitely you have a crisis at the EU.
Can I just propose an alternative to this? This crisis will actually result in the fiscal transfers and the fiscal consolidation you need to make the euro work. In history, over any period of time, a currency without fiscal probity doesn't work. So let me reverse the bearish case you've just made. The Germans may be learning, but they're learning what this is about, and Ireland is the test case. This is going to be the example of fiscal transfers. We are dealing in fiscal transfers. This is New York to Detroit. Doesn't matter how you dress it up.
Yeah.
That is what it represents. Actually, in the medium term, for a country that's going to be, what, 5% of the population in 30 years' time? Sorry, a region of the world's population in 30 years' time, we have to have this. Individual countries in Europe pretending that they matter individually is nonsense. You have to have this consolidated region one day for Europe to have any chance whatsoever of competing. Or am I being completely ridiculous?
No, I completely agree. I think right now, as they're moving ahead, they're learning, but they're learning, and again I would re-emphasize what the Greek Prime Minister said, and they are possibly breaking the backs of certain countries. So for sure, I think the Greek crisis could have been avoided had the Germans stepped in faster and had the Germans censored themselves a little bit better.
John, we've got to wrap it up there, but thanks very much for coming in and speaking with us this morning.